An apple a day keeps the doctor away. But what if an apple caused humanity's greatest downfall? Welcome to a journey that challenges everything you thought you knew about the Garden of Eden. For centuries, we've been told that Adam and Eve were cast out of paradise for eating a forbidden apple. It's a story ingrained in our culture, depicted in countless paintings and referenced in literature throughout the ages. But what if I told you? There was never an apple mentioned in the Bible's account of Eden. In the next minutes, we're going to explore a controversial theory that has been whispered in theological circles and debated by scholars. What if the forbidden fruit wasn't a fruit at all? What if it was a metaphor for something far more intimate? We'll delve into the original text, examine cultural contexts, and challenge our preconceptions about one of the most famous stories ever told. Could it be that the original sin was not about dietary disobedience, but about sexuality and knowledge? But before we dive in, I want to make something clear. This video presents an alternative interpretation of a religious text. It's not meant to offend or to be taken as absolute truth. Rather, it's an invitation to think critically, to question, and to engage with ancient texts in new ways. Whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or just curious, I encourage you to keep an open mind as we unravel this biblical mystery. Remember, the goal here isn't to prove anyone right or wrong, but to explore the fascinating ways we can interpret stories that have shaped our world. Are you ready to take a bite out of this forbidden theory? Let's begin. To understand why this new interpretation is so groundbreaking, we first need to revisit the traditional story. Let's turn our pages to the book of Genesis, chapters 2 and 3. The story goes that God created the first man, Adam, and placed him in the Garden of Eden. Seeing that Adam was alone, God created Eve as his companion. The garden was a paradise, filled with every kind of tree pleasing to the eye and good for food. But in the middle of the garden stood two special trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God commanded Adam and Eve, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." Enter the serpent, who tempts Eve to eat the fruit from the forbidden tree. Eve succumbs to temptation, eats the fruit, and shares it with Adam. Suddenly, their eyes are opened. They become aware of their nakedness, feel shame, and try to hide from God. As punishment for their disobedience, God banishes them from Eden, cursing them with mortality, hard labor, and painful childbirth. This event is often referred to as the fall of mankind. Now here's where it gets interesting. Nowhere in this account does the Bible specifically mention an apple. Yet for centuries, Western culture has depicted the forbidden fruit as an apple. We see it in countless paintings, sculptures, and even in modern pop culture references. But why an apple? The association likely comes from a mix of linguistic coincidence and artistic tradition. In Latin, the words for evil and apple are similar, malum for evil and malum for apple. This wordplay might have influenced early Christian art. Moreover, apples were common and familiar fruits in Europe, where much of Christian art developed. They were round, sweet, and tempting, perfect for symbolizing forbidden desire. So, we have a story of temptation, disobedience, and punishment, traditionally symbolized by an apple. But what if this fruit was never meant to be taken literally? What if it represents something else entirely? That's where our alternative theory comes in, which we'll explore next. Now that we've explored the traditional story and its apple-centric interpretation, it's time to take a bite out of this narrative and see what's really inside. Let's peel back the layers of assumption and examine what the text actually says, or doesn't say. First and foremost, let's address the elephant, or should I say the apple, in the room. If you were to scour every verse of Genesis, you'd find something surprising. There's not a single mention of an apple. The text simply refers to the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. No species, no color, no crunch, just fruit. This vagueness is our first clue. If the specific type of fruit was crucial to the story, wouldn't it have been mentioned? The fact that it wasn't suggests that perhaps the fruit itself isn't the point. Maybe, just maybe, it's a stand-in for something else entirely. But to understand why this might be the case, we need to zoom out and look at Genesis as a whole. This book is rich with symbolism and metaphor. Think about it. A talking serpent, trees of life and knowledge, the entire world created in 7 days. These elements aren't meant to be taken literally by many theological scholars. Instead, they're often interpreted as rich symbols conveying deeper truths about human nature, morality, and our relationship with the divine. This symbolic approach to Genesis opens up a world of alternative interpretations. Scholars and theologians have proposed various ideas about what the fruit might represent. 1. Consciousness and self-awareness. 2. Free will and moral responsibility. 3. Agricultural knowledge. 4. And yes, even human sexuality. Each of these interpretations tries to make sense of the profound change that occurs in Adam and Eve after eating the fruit. They suddenly become aware of their nakedness, feel shame, and gain a new kind of knowledge. But what kind of fruit could cause such a dramatic shift in perception? It's hard to imagine a literal piece of fruit, no matter how delicious, causing such a fundamental change in human consciousness. This is why many scholars argue that the fruit is a metaphor for a more profound kind of knowledge or experience. As we question the literal apple, we open ourselves to a richer, more nuanced understanding of this ancient story. We're not just asking what kind of fruit it was, but what it represents about the human experience, our choices, and our relationship with the divine. We've questioned the apple, and now it's time to bite into the core of our alternative theory. What if the forbidden fruit wasn't a fruit at all, but a metaphor for sexual knowledge? This interpretation suggests that the original sin wasn't about eating something, but about Adam and Eve becoming sexually aware and active. Let's break this theory down and examine the evidence that supports it. The theory explained. The crux of this interpretation is that God's command not to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil was actually a prohibition against sexual activity. In this view, the serpent's temptation represents sexual desire, and the act of eating the fruit symbolizes Adam and Eve engaging in sexual intercourse. This theory posits that God intended for humans to procreate eventually, but not yet, perhaps not until they had developed more wisdom or spiritual maturity. By giving in to sexual temptation too soon, Adam and Eve gained carnal knowledge before they were ready, leading to their expulsion from Eden. Textual evidence. Now let's look at some textual evidence that supports this interpretation. 1. Knowledge of good and evil. Show Hebrew text with translation. The phrase knowledge of good and evil is key. In Hebrew, to know, yada, can be a euphemism for sexual intercourse. We see this elsewhere in the Bible, such as in Genesis 4 verse 1, and Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived. In many ancient Near Eastern cultures, sexual knowledge was often equated with adult wisdom and maturity. The idea of knowing good and evil could thus represent a transition from innocence to adult awareness, including sexual awareness. 2. Shame and nakedness. Perhaps the most compelling evidence for this theory comes right after Adam and Eve eat the fruit. The text tells us, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." This sudden awareness of nakedness and the resulting shame strongly suggest a sexual awakening. If they had simply eaten a literal fruit, why would they suddenly be embarrassed about their bodies? The use of fig leaves to cover their genitals, rather than their mouths or stomachs, further supports the idea that their transgression was sexual in nature. Cultural and historical context. To understand why this interpretation might make sense, we need to consider the cultural and historical context of Genesis. In many ancient Near Eastern cultures, stories of divine gardens often had sexual undertones. Sacred trees were sometimes associated with fertility goddesses, and serpents were often seen as symbols of fertility and sexual power. Moreover, in the agricultural societies of the ancient Near East, human sexuality and agricultural fertility were often linked conceptually. The idea of knowing the land was sometimes used as a metaphor for cultivation, which in turn could be a metaphor for sexual activity. It's also worth noting that many ancient cultures had myths about how humans gained sexual knowledge, often through divine or semi-divine intervention. The Genesis story, in this light, could be seen as the Hebrew version of this common mythological theme. This interpretation also provides a different perspective on why the consequence of eating the fruit was so severe. If it was just about disobedience regarding a piece of fruit, the punishment of expulsion from Eden might seem disproportionate. But if it represents premature sexual awakening and the loss of innocence, the gravity of the situation becomes clearer. It's important to remember that this is still a theory, an interpretation of the text. It's not accepted by all scholars or religious authorities. However, it does offer a compelling way to understand this pivotal story in human cultural history. Now that we've explored the sex theory interpretation of the forbidden fruit, it's time to weigh the evidence. Like any good scholarly debate, there are compelling arguments both for and against this provocative interpretation. Let's break them down. Supporting arguments. First, let's look at the arguments that support the idea of the forbidden fruit as a metaphor for sexual knowledge. 1. Explains the sudden awareness of nakedness. One of the strongest arguments for this theory is how well it explains Adam and Eve's sudden awareness of their nakedness. If the fruit was literal, why would eating it make them ashamed of their bodies? However, if it represents sexual awakening, their new self-consciousness makes perfect sense. Return to host. This interpretation provides a logical explanation for the immediate consequence of their actions. It connects the dots between the act of disobedience and the resulting shame in a way that feels psychologically authentic. Fits with themes of temptation and shame. The sexual interpretation also aligns well with the broader themes of temptation and shame that run throughout the Bible. Sexual desire is often portrayed as a powerful and potentially dangerous force in many religious contexts. If we view the Eden story as a cautionary tale about the power of sexual temptation, it fits neatly with other biblical narratives about the dangers of unchecked desire. This thematic consistency lends credibility to the sexual interpretation. Counterarguments. Now let's consider some arguments against this interpretation. 1. God's command to be fruitful and multiply. One of the strongest counterarguments comes from earlier in Genesis. In chapter 1, verse 28, God commands Adam and Eve to be fruitful and multiply. This seems to suggest that sex was part of God's plan from the beginning. If sex itself was forbidden, why would God have given this command? This apparent contradiction challenges the idea that the forbidden fruit represents sexual knowledge. Number 2. Alternative explanations for awareness of nakedness. While the sudden awareness of nakedness does suggest a sexual component, there are other possible explanations. It could represent a broader awakening of self-consciousness, the birth of shame as a concept, or the beginning of moral awareness. Some scholars argue that the knowledge of good and evil represents moral autonomy or adult consciousness more broadly, not just sexual knowledge. In this view, the awareness of nakedness symbolizes a loss of innocence in a more general sense. It's also worth noting that many traditional interpretations have explained these elements without resorting to a sexual reading of the story. The longevity and prevalence of non-sexual interpretations suggest that the text can be coherently understood in other ways. As we can see, both sides of this debate have valid points. The sexual interpretation offers some intriguing explanations for elements of the story, but it also faces some significant challenges from the text itself and from alternative interpretations. This debate reminds us of the rich complexity of ancient texts. Stories that have endured for thousands of years often contain layers of meaning and can be interpreted in multiple ways. Whether or not we accept the sexual interpretation of the forbidden fruit, engaging with these ideas can deepen our understanding of this foundational story. As we near the end of our journey through Eden, it's time to consider the broader implications of this controversial interpretation. If we accept the idea that the forbidden fruit represents sexual knowledge, how does it change our understanding of this ancient story, and what impact might it have on religious views of sexuality? How it changes our understanding of the fall. Interpreting the forbidden fruit as a metaphor for sexual knowledge dramatically reshapes our understanding of the fall of man. Instead of simple disobedience or a desire for wisdom, the original sin becomes tied to human sexuality. This shifts the narrative from one of mere rule-breaking to a story about the loss of innocence through sexual awakening. The fall, in this light, represents humanity's transition from a state of childlike naivety to adult consciousness, with all the complexity and moral responsibility that entails. Moreover, this interpretation suggests that the knowledge gained wasn't just intellectual, but deeply experiential and transformative. It paints a picture of God as a parent figure, perhaps trying to protect Adam and Eve from growing up too fast, rather than simply imposing arbitrary rules. Potential impact on views of sexuality in religion. The implications of this interpretation for religious views on sexuality are profound and potentially controversial. If sexual knowledge was the original sin, it might seem to cast sexuality in a negative light, as the source of humanity's fall from grace. However, it's not that simple. This interpretation also recognizes the power and importance of sexuality in human experience. It acknowledges sex as a form of knowledge so potent that it can fundamentally change our state of being. For some, this could lead to a more open discussion about sexuality within religious contexts. It might encourage a view of sex as something powerful and transformative, rather than simply as a biological function or a source of temptation. On the other hand, it could also be used to justify more restrictive attitudes towards sexuality, seeing it as something so powerful that it needs to be carefully controlled. Ultimately, like many religious interpretations, the impact of this view would depend largely on how it's understood and applied. It could lead to more nuanced, mature discussions about the role of sexuality in human life and spirituality, or it could reinforce existing taboos and restrictions. What's clear is that this interpretation, if accepted, would require a reevaluation of many traditional religious teachings about sexuality, gender roles, and the nature of sin and innocence. As we conclude our exploration of this theory, it's important to remember that this is just one interpretation among many. The strength of ancient stories like the Garden of Eden lies in their ability to bear multiple meanings and to evolve with our understanding. Whether or not we accept this particular interpretation, engaging with these ideas can deepen our appreciation for the complexity of religious texts and the profound questions they continue to raise about human nature, morality, and our place in the universe.